From the stomach, the lower GI tract continues on into the intestines. So we'll look at those next. This section is going to look at the small intestine, focusing on how it maximizes surface area for absorption, and at the large intestine, just mentioning a few aspects of its anatomy. In this block, there are pictures addressing the accessory organs, but those are going to be handled in the next section. In the oral cavity, we begin to break down carbohydrates enzymatically. In the stomach, we begin to break down proteins enzymatically. In the small intestine, that's where we do most of the enzymatic degradation of lipids, and we continue breaking down carbohydrates and proteins. Then, those macromolecules need to be absorbed into the bloodstream. To maximize the ability of the small intestine to absorb nutrients, it has a very extensive surface area. And there are 4 ways that that surface area is maximized, listed here: length, circular folds, villi, and microvilli. So let me explain those in depth in the next few slides. The small intestine starts with duodenum, which comes off of the stomach, and then goes into a region called the jejunum, and then the second half of the intestines are the ileum. Now, if the food moving out of the stomach and into the large intestine just went as a straight shot, it might only be the length of the duodenum. The rest of the small intestines are really just folded over to make for a very long tube. Perhaps the length of the tube, if it went straight from the end of the stomach to the beginning of the large intestine, would be maybe 20 centimeters. But its very tortuous path through the intestines is much longer, maybe 5 to 7 meters in length. And that right there just increases surface area immensely. Area is length times width, and if we're talking about the inner surface of a tube, the width is the circumference of the tube. So if the tube is only 20 centimeters long and the average diameter of the small intestine is about 2.5 centimeters, that would mean that the surface area of a 20 centimeter tube would be about 150 centimeters squared. But increasing that to 5 to 7 meters in length would increase the amount of surface area to, I think it comes out to about 3,500 square centimeters, just in increasing the length. Circular folds are the mucosa of the small intestine being scrunched up along its length. If we were to flatten that out, the mucosa would just be a flat surface with its inherent texture that we'll talk about in a second, but it might be 5 or 10 times longer than it was, just by flattening out those folds. That texture that we can see along the surface of the mucosa in the circular folds image are finger-like extensions of the mucosal surface called villi. The epithelium is wrapped around these villi, just providing more surface area fit into a smaller space. And we have more cells that can then absorb more nutrients. And that might increase the surface area by another factor of 10. At the smallest level, right where absorption is taking place across the apical surface of these cells, the cell membrane is found in finger-like extensions, also called microvilli. Again, increasing the surface area, but another order of magnitude, perhaps. All of these factors together can really increase the surface area in the lining of the small intestine. Traditional representations of the length and surface area of the structure suggest that it might be as big as a tennis court, all folded up and stuffed inside your abdominal cavity. There is a mechanical digestion process in the small intestine called segmentation. This is where circular fibers pinch off segments of the small intestine so that the food's separated into little regions. And then circular fibers alternate back and forth, pinching in the middle of these segments and mixing the half of one segment with the half of the adjacent segment, and then pinching off again and mixing half of that just mixed segment in with half of the adjacent just mixed segment. And this helps to really mix up the food and homogenize it so that it's easier for enzymes to get in and break things down. This is a mechanical digestion process, but it's also actually coupled with propulsion, and in peristaltic waves, these segments move along the length of the small intestine. The regions of the large intestine are laid out here. It begins with the cecum, where the ileum of the small intestine attaches to it. There's a valve called the ileocecal valve to ensure that food matter only moves from the small intestine into the large intestine and not the other direction. Also next to the cecum is the appendix. Its full name is the vermiform appendix because that means it's shaped like a worm. And this is the structure that was introduced in the lymphatic system that helps to regulate the population of flora or bacteria that live in the large intestine. We don't want those overgrowing the large intestine and moving into the small intestine. The colon then goes up towards the liver, where it turns on the right side at the hepatic flexure, crosses over and turns again next to the spleen at the splenic flexure, descends and then takes sort of an S-shaped curve around where the sigmoid colon is and ends in the rectum and the anus. The rectum, when it stretches out as it accumulates feces, will initiate reflexive defecation, opening the internal anal sphincter and pushing the feces out. Under circumstances where that's not socially appropriate, for instance, you have voluntary control over the external anal sphincter, and you can wait until you can go to a restroom and void your rectum. This figure demonstrates the structure of the mucosa of the large intestine. The book points out here that there are a population of cells, goblet cells, which secrete the mucus there. And they're very obvious. They are called goblet cells because they have a void in them filled with the very watery mucus of the digestive system. This is a little misleading, however, because goblet cells are actually found in the small intestine too. Just they're very prominent in the large intestine, so we see them here. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. The circular folds, which are sometimes referred to as the plici circularis, which is just the Latin word for that, scrunch up the mucosa in the sense that there are folds that can be flattened out, making the length of the small intestine mucosa longer.